All right, so this video is going to be all about the cell cycle and when the cell cycle becomes unregulated and leads to cancer. So, we're going to be talking about how the cell cycle can go wrong and what the causes of cancer are. So, throughout the cell cycle, there are checkpoints that are going to make sure that the cell cycle is being carried out correctly. So, if we look at this image here, we can see at the end of G1, let me put my pointer, at the end of G1, which is the growth phase of interphase, there's a checkpoint to make sure that there's no damage to the DNA. Then, and let's think about why that would be important, because when we go into the S phase of interphase, we're actually going to double our DNA. So we want to make sure that we're not doubling up damaged DNA. There's another checkpoint at the end of G2, which is going to make sure that after the DNA has been duplicated, that there's no DNA damage, because we don't want to then again pass it into a daughter cell in mitosis. And then we have one more checkpoint right in metaphase of mitosis to make sure that those chromosomes are lined up in the middle correctly, so that when the sister chromatids are pulled apart, they are pulled correctly to the opposite sides of the cell. So, what are our learning goals with this? We want to compare cell division in healthy and cancerous cells. We want to explain why cancerous cells are harmful to the body and talk about technologies and substances that can cause cancer. So, these checkpoints that I mentioned, what do they do? So, they are stops to make sure that the cell cycle is working properly. And if cells don't pass a checkpoint, they are supposed to stay in that phase, fix whatever the issue is, and then they can continue on through the cell cycle. So essentially, there's another phase that a cell can go into if it is not dividing. So let's think about this. Cells are not always dividing. That makes sense. We don't have enough room in our body or enough energy to always be dividing and making new cells. We only need to replace old cells when we need them. And so, what we can do is we can put our cells in a resting phase called G0. And this is a resting phase. And there's kind of two different reasons that a cell would enter that resting phase. So, it can be temporary reasons. So where it says example cells in your notes. So I'd like you to record both this temporary reason versus a permanent reason. So for example, if you're not working out, if you're not actively trying to build new muscle cells, then your muscle cells, they're going to be in this G0 phase, this resting phase, until you're going to be working out more, and you might be damaging muscle tissue and rebuilding new tissue. However, there are some types of cells that the G0 phase is permanent, like nerve cells. And that's why brain damage and damage to the spinal cord is so serious, because when the cell is formed, it's going to go into the G0 phase. It's never going to re-enter the cell cycle for new division and therefore replacement. So if you damage your spinal cord, for example, the damage is permanent. And that's why people who have spinal cord injuries, it could be handicapped permanently. Okay, so let's talk about cell death. So what happens if a cell is damaged or it doesn't pass one of those checkpoints and it can't fix whatever the issue is at the checkpoint? Well, so cells actually have a lifespan. They do not live forever. They usually only divide about 50 times and then they die. And so there's two major ways that cells die. One of them is called necrosis. And this would be the kind of cell death that takes place if there is damage from the outside. So, for example, if you cut your finger with a knife when you're cutting tomatoes, that knife cut and tore and damaged those skin cells on your hand. So that was damage to your skin cells from the outside. However, there's another really important type of cell death called apoptosis. It's also called programmed cell death or cell suicide. It is literally coded into cells that if there is enough damage on the inside of them, or they have divided too many times and they are worn out, or their DNA is damaged, or they can't make it past those checkpoints in the cell cycle, they will do apoptosis, where they will essentially delete themselves. So necrosis, damage from the outside, and apoptosis is considered programmed cell death or programmed cell suicide. Okay, so what is cancer? And let's kind of talk about why is cancer related to the cell cycle. So cancer is basically unregulated cell growth, meaning that something is wrong with how these cells are going through the cell cycle. They're not listening to the checkpoints anymore. They are dividing out of control. So cancer cells divide too much. And instead of dying, like we talked about in the last slide, instead of having that programmed cell death called apoptosis, they actually don't have any don't have any messages to delete themselves, and instead they keep dividing and dividing out of control. Another important thing that they do is they rush through interphase. And remember all of the important stuff that happens in interphase. We double up our DNA and duplicate it so that we can divide it into two identical daughter cells. So if you're rushing through that, there is a potential that the DNA is going to be copied incorrectly, and you're now going to be passing down things like mutations. Also, in interphase, cell growth is taking place. Remember, we're going from this, the cytoplasm is like doubling in size. Because they rush through interphase, we're going to see in a moment here that cancer cells are usually smaller and weirdly shaped. So if we look at these two images here, we can see that this cell right here in a healthy cell division, it's going to, if there's some sort of issue in cell division, you see how this cell doesn't look like these other ones. There's some sort of issue or mutation. In normal cell division, boom, this cell is going to commit cell suicide. It is going to do apoptosis, and it's going to delete itself. But if we look at the cell division in cancer, we can see, okay, there's a misformed, there's some sort of issue in this cell. So it should be checked by the cell cycle. It should do apoptosis and delete itself. But instead, it just keeps dividing and dividing and dividing and having uncontrolled cell growth. Okay, so then what's kind of the consequence of this uncontrolled cell growth? Something called tumors. When cells grow out of control, they're going to start to pile on top of each other. They need a place to go. So they're going to pile up. And because they're piling up and they're kind of squishing together, like we can see here, not only are the cancer cells themselves, because they're so squished together, they're not going to be behaving like a normal body cell. And on top of that, they're actually going to be harming the cells around them and making it so that it's hard for the cells around them to be doing their functions, the specific jobs that they were specialized to do. So tumors, the cells pile up, they don't have function, and they harm the cells around them. So now in a tumor, if we run out of space, what can happen is something called metastasis. And metastasis is really bad news because it means that the cancer is going from one location and is now going to spread. So what happens in metastasis is that one of the cancerous cells breaks away from that tumor and it enters into the bloodstream. And you guys, the bloodstream is like the highway to all the other different organs of the body. So what could happen is, as an example, let's say that you have stomach cancer. Okay, if a person has stomach cancer and so a tumor is growing in their stomach, one of those cancerous cells or a handful of those cancerous cells break off of that stomach cancer tumor and enter the bloodstream. It could then be taken to the lungs, and now that person has lung cancer. And it could also spread to the kidneys, and that person now has cancer in their kidneys. So this is the really scary part about metastasis, is that the cancer can now invade other organs of the body. So let's take a look now at how cancerous cells versus healthy body cells look under the microscope. So you can see in looking at the healthy body cells that have gone through normal regulated mitosis, they have similar shapes, sizes. Their nucleus is formed correctly. They don't have random shapes, right? They look healthy. And we compare them to the cancerous cells, and you can see that they're misshapen. They are shaped very randomly. They're smaller because they rushed through interphase. They didn't have enough time to grow correctly. And so go ahead and get these recorded in your notes, right? That they're close together. You can see even these ones are like jammed on top of each other. So this is a very unhealthy cell shape. And we know that these cells are not going to be able to perform their correct function. And so if you're thinking about like, how do doctors diagnose somebody with cancer? This is one of the key ways that doctors can diagnose cancer. They can take a sample of someone's tumor to make sure, is this tumor actually containing cancerous cells? And if they look under the microscope and they see features like this, cells that are misshapen, randomly shaped, smaller in size and close together, they're going to know that they're dealing with a cancerous tumor. Okay, so what causes cancer? So essentially, what causes cancer are mutations. And mutations are changes in the DNA. Now, if you remember, your DNA is like the instruction manual to make an organism. And so if there are any changes in how the DNA is copied, like right here, we see one part of the strand of DNA was copied incorrectly. And so now this strand of DNA is actually going to carry a mutation if it keeps getting replicated. So, the kinds of mutations that can cause cancer could be a mutation like this that actually tells the cell to ignore the cell cycle checkpoints, allowing it to become cancerous. So, besides mutations causing cancer, we also have external factors in our environment that can also cause mutations or damage or changes in our DNA that can lead to cancer. So, in our home environment, we have things like UV rays from the sun that can cause skin cancer. We have aerosol cleaning sprays that can cause cancer. We have pesticides that we put on our food that are known to cause cancer. In our foods that we eat, there are different types of foods that are actually high risk for cancer. The biggest one being any kind of meat that is like lunch meat, hot dogs, any kind of processed meat. They are labeled as carcinogens, meaning they are things that can cause cancer, and they are known to cause cancer. There are lifestyle choices that are carcinogens, like cigarettes. They contain many carcinogens in them, making them toxic to use for long periods of time. In industry, different components and ingredients in paints, different ingredients in building materials are actually considered carcinogens. And that's why people who work in construction, they're working with certain materials, they have to wear protective wear to make sure that they don't breathe in those carcinogens. Finally, there are actually viruses, and we'll learn more about this in our sexual health unit. There are viruses that cause cancer, like HPV or human papillomavirus. It can lead to cervical cancer, like we read about and watched about with Henrietta Lacks. The cancer that she died from, cervical cancer, was caused by the HPV virus. Okay, so I hope that this was informative and it helped you complete your notes on the cell cycle and cancer.